Now, let's shift to economics here, because you're all business ultimately here, right? So we got to think about business. And this goes back to this article, actually, and ultimately it was a book on this long boom. I do want to just bring it up to you guys, because I think there is a very vital thing to understand about the technology as a driver of essentially long-term economic growth. Now, so when people, the long boom essentially is talking about not a stock booms or, it was essentially talking about the fundamental drivers of long-term robust economic growth. And what happens essentially is technology and the integration of actors in a market, increasing integration, those two factors, when you look at those things, when those things shift, they often, if not always, drive sustained economic growth in the big picture, the long run. Now, let's just take an example of how it works. And you can see this in the post-war era, the Great Postwar Era, which we all thought about as the great kind of economic boom of not just the United States, the West, all over the world. In essence, what happened there, I would argue, and argued in these other contexts as he mentioned, is essentially you had two things happen, big trends, that are very reminiscent of what we're seeing today, so it's worth going over. You had World War II ended, and those two big drivers surfaced. One is you had a range of technologies that period that had been developed in the war or before the war that all of a sudden went rushing into the private sector. Mainframe computers, atomic energy, commercial aviation, plastics. I mean, you name it. There was a ton of technologies at that time that went whoomp into the private sector. That, and you had half the world, the free world, organize themselves in a much more tightly integrated way. And so what happened? Boom. In the 50s, you had an American boom, particularly. And why America? It had survived the war, for one, and it pretty much intact. But also, Americans love to jump on new technologies, and they had the most open economy to take advantage of that kind of integration. So you had this crazy, nostalgic, we still talk about the great 50s, all the boats rising and building suburbia. But by the 60s, all Europe was on its feet, Japan was back on its feet, was totally booming. And it was only in the 70s when you essentially got the lifeblood of that industrial economy, oil, that kind of, with the oil shocks, and you kind of screwed up the whole thing, and that you essentially ended what had been about a 25 to 30-year run of really long-term fundamental long-run growth. Now, take our era. I would make a strong argument that in general, you can think of this same phenomena basically happen. And what happened in the 80s? The Cold War essentially ends. And there was a wind down before it formally kind of ended, but it was clearly that this is ending. And so what happened at the end of the Cold War? All the technologies developed basically for military reasons. Computer chips. The beginning of the integrated circuits were for guided missiles. That's what drove them. The internet itself, communication in kind of nuclear war, we all talked about the origins of that. But spy satellites turn into GPS systems. I mean, all this kinds of technology just goes washing into the private sector, right? That's one thing. And then the second thing is the fact you take not just half the world, but you take the entire world, and you get them all integrated on the same global economy. Wow, that's a big deal. We talked about the 80s. You got those two trends come together. What happens in the 90s? America's booming. Why America? They love this technology. They jump on it quick, and they're a very open economy, and so they can take advantage of it, right? So they're just going crazy. The great 90s boom, of course, we're all just like giddy about it here in the United States. But what happens this last decade, the 2000s, after the 2000, the entire world is booming. And when I say the entire world this time, it's not just Europe we're talking about. In fact, the real boom is China, India, the developing world, just like it was Japan and the kind of recovering Europeans of the 60s. That's the boom. That's the long boom. It might not have been as robust in the United States this last decade. In fact, there's hand-wringing about job creation, all this other stuff. But globally, the same phenomenon is going on. And the question is, what's going to happen this decade? Now, some would say we had a similar kind of flip out, which was very similar to the 70s thing, given the big crash. But ultimately, I think there's a lot to be played out here of what's really going to happen. I would say plenty more robust growth ahead in the global economy. So another thing to think about, too, because business people always get worried about recessions, and for good reasons, in terms of if you're looking at the kind of quarterly reports or that, the near-term kind of thing. But in the long run, essentially, this is GDP growth in the United States from the Great Depression basically to currently. And these red things are essentially recessions, and the length of recessions is how wide they are. So, of course, you had the Great Depression in the early times that really screwed things up to the 30s there from 29 on. But essentially, this is the 50s. The Great 50s we talked about as the great boats, all boats rising. It was hammered with recessions. They were constantly working on recessions. This is, in fact, the 70s. We're getting hammered with recessions. Our era here, even if you include this last one, which we were technically out of now for a while, is relatively light on recessions. And the ultimate thing is what I'm saying is what really powers through is the long-term trend here. Where is that long-term trend going? Granted, it was a big dip here, similar back down there in trauma, essentially, to what we happened in the 29 crash. But roughly, there's a lot of upward motion. Globally, it's totally still tracking. Essentially, this is the post-war boom of essentially GDP, that top line there. We've now got a $65 trillion economy. It's slowed down a little bit since the late 20th century, but it's still tracking very nicely. And then you get China. And there's a lot of concern about China. What's going on with China? Let's just put China in context here, too. China didn't have an economy up until Deng Xiaoping opened the economy up in more of a free market way in basically 78. But look at that. This is GDP growth. They didn't have GDP, essentially, until, boom, it started kicking in after that. Now, they are, as we well know, on a roll here in a kind of a very different way now. We're looking at growth into the century here. So let's just take, these are numbers from Goldman Sachs, not Pete Leiden here. This is up to 2050. Now, this is essentially projected American GDP growth. America, the biggest economy in the world, essentially going to track in pretty nicely through the next 50 years, probably here. That's China. Boom, surpassing the United States. People are actually arguing that's probably going to happen earlier. It has a lot to do with how the two countries perform, but roughly no one's disputing that that's surpassing the United States. That's India on a slightly stutter step behind, but it's ultimately catching the same upward trends by mid-century. That's Germany. That's Japan, that last one, essentially flatlining, and that's Germany. Now, Germany is part of the European Union, so it's a little different metric, but just look at those countries. Germany and Japan. So essentially, if you take the 2050 look here, that's the snapshot of the global economy in 2050. So the two powerhouses of the 20th century, beyond the United States, Germany, Japan, basically irrelevant in terms of the real drivers of the global economy. Now, Europe itself is a bigger animal, and Germany's part of that, so I don't want to get into that. But I'm just saying, what a reframing of how you got to think about economics. Now, the other thing I do want to say, though, is I was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek in Asia in the late 80s before I went to Wired. And there was a similar talk, all this hand-wringing about Japan at the time. I think it's worth just reminding ourselves here. In the 90s there, Japan was on an incredible roll in terms of their industrial economy. And we're doing terrific, and everybody was thinking, oh my God. And the United States, meanwhile, was really floundering in the 80s too, in many respects, the economy. Everyone was wringing their hands of where it was going. And so I remember doing all these stories about we're all going to be working for Japanese companies, and the world economy is essentially going to be Japanese very soon here. And of course, what happened in the 90s, no one could predict it, but you watch Japan go into this stagnation, which, there's many reasons for we could describe, including demographic, but ultimately the United States kind of had this bounce, this reinvention through particularly internet technologies and others. So it was like, never really, follow the trend lines too tightly there. I would say the same thing is a little bit going on here about just talking about China and the United States this last decade. And I would argue, just keeping fluid here about what's going forward here, is I think it's not clear where these two economies are going to go. And I think it's very often we've watched these reinventions happen, about what goes on in the United States and also what I think could go on in China. Two examples here with China. China's done a remarkable job of bringing the poverty rate down. They had, in 1980, when they started this project, they had 80% of the people were living on $1.25 a day. And you go, wow, look at they've brought that down to 2009. It's 18%. But that's still 234 million people are essentially living on basically nothing, very, very little. There's nobody in the United States or European countries in that kind of space. Anyhow, huge kind of challenges in terms of the fabric of their basic society. And another one I'll just mention in terms of anyone who's been doing traveling in China, as I have over the years, I mean, the environmental damage is just insane. I mean, for example, here what they've got here, there's only 1% of China's 560 million city residents who breathe air that's considered safe by the European Union, or basically by the United States standards too. I mean, they know this. I mean, they are, you know, if you talk to the Chinese, they're trying to figure out very huge challenges, just like there's huge challenges all over the world.